By the start of 1942, Japan's southern advance had swallowed airfields across Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, Burma, and the Philippines, faster than any staff plan had accounted for. 3,000 miles of new territory in under 4 months, and for a few weeks, the air arm behind that advance ran on rails. Fuel was plentiful. Spare parts arrived close to schedule. Aircrews flew from bases still stocked with the fuel and equipment their previous defenders had left behind. At full strength, a Zero fighter went into an overhaul bay every 150 flying hours, stripped down, checked, and returned to its squadron on a rhythm a peacetime air service might have kept. Sitting in the cockpit of one of those fighters on a captured strip outside Saigon, a pilot could look down a flight line of intact, fueled, freshly serviced aircraft and see a machine running as designed. That picture was already less solid than it looked. The Imperial Army and the Imperial Navy ran separate air services down to the smallest detail. Different electrical voltages, different radio sets, different training pipelines, and neither trusted the other enough to share so much as a spare part. Maintenance units on both sides had a habit of arriving weeks behind the aircrews they were meant to support, which left pilots and aircrew servicing their own machines between missions instead of resting for the next one. By April 1942, naval air units advancing through the Indies were already short of the 1/3 reserve strength their own tables of organization called for, and the Naval General Staff turned down requests to fix it because the carriers came first and everything else waited its turn. Then came a campaign nobody on either side had planned for. When American forces seized the half-built airstrip on Guadalcanal in August 1942, the Japanese response was improvised from the start. In the first 10 months of the Pacific War, the Navy had managed to finish one new airfield of its own forward of its original bases, a lone rough runway at Buin on Bougainville, and even that took months of rain, delayed construction, and cost 7 of the first 15 Zeros damage just landing on it. Once it was open, a wet day at Buin could still write off close to 10 aircraft through landing accidents alone, the same mud and poor drainage claiming machines that no enemy pilot ever had to touch. 2 days into the fight for Guadalcanal, 18 dive bombers ditched into the sea out of fuel because nobody had built the intermediate strips, a mission of that range required. At forward fields like Rabaul, there were no tractors to move aircraft between revetments, so ground crews pushed them by hand, and fuel came out of 200-liter drums through hand pumps rather than trucks, a process that consumed manpower and turned every refueling into its own small ordeal. The climate did the rest of the damage on its own. Near constant rain and humidity corroded exposed metal fittings within weeks of a fresh coat of paint, lubricating oils evaporated faster than resupply ships could replace them, and electrical components grew fungus in the tropical damp. An air arm already short of spare parts and trained hands could absorb far less of that ordinary wear than one that had both to spare. By 1943, the strain had become structural rather than occasional. Rabaul alone could carry 60 fighters and 40 bombers on its books. The 23rd Air Flotilla's own loss accounting from those opening months makes the underlying arithmetic clear. Of 88 aircraft the unit wrote off, enemy action accounted for only 18. Landing and takeoff accidents on runways never built for sustained combat operations wrecked close to half, and units with no depot capacity beyond a basic patch job scrapped the rest, close to a third of the total, once ordinary wear ran them past the point of economical repair. The enemy was, for most of that unit's losses, beside the point. On a given day at Rabaul, a mix of about 30 out of that 100 could fly. That July, a Navy pilot stationed at Buin wrote in his diary about ground crews dragging their exhausted bodies across the field to push aircraft back under cover after dark, adding that the men dreamed of the tractors the Americans seemed to have without limit, a dream they already knew would not come true. By then, Japan had put something like 90 basic aircraft types into production, Army and Navy combined, with more than 150 additional variants layered on top of those, running on 2 incompatible electrical standards and mismatched mounts for guns and rocket rails. A mechanic trained on one airframe often could not move down the flight line to fix the next type. Radio equipment fared no better. Spare parts grew so scarce and the sets so unreliable that some pilots removed their radios altogether rather than carry the extra weight for a set that, more often than not, would not work when needed. Trained technicians stayed scarce throughout because neither service showed much interest in sending men to ordnance schools when pilots seemed like the more urgent shortage. Whether that reflected a deliberate choice to favor cockpits over wrenches, or simply a smaller industrial population with fewer trained men to spare for either job, is not a question the surviving records settle. The same strain reached backward into flight school. As 1943 wore into 1944, combat units pulled Japan's most experienced instructors out of training commands and back into the fight, replacing the veterans those units kept losing, which meant the men left to teach new pilots often had little more experience than their own students. Standards fell with them. By 1944, the air services were taking candidates who would have washed out in 1941 because they needed bodies in cockpits faster than proper training could supply them. Saburo Sakai, one of the Navy's surviving aces, described the same compression in his own account. Pilots who had once trained for years now finished in months. American Lieutenant General George Kenney, watching the quality of the Japanese air crews he faced over New Guinea decline through 1943 and 1944, reported much the same thing to Washington in blunter terms. Japan had, by then, lost most of the excellent air crews it started the war with, and nothing coming out of the shortened pipeline replaced them. The numbers behind Kenney's assessment were almost exactly even. By the end of 1943, Japan's Army and Navy air services had lost something close to 10,000 pilots combined since the war began, against something close to 10,400 just trained pilots produced by both services over the same stretch. On paper, the force was holding its size. In practice, it was trading veterans for novices at close to a 1-for-1 rate, and every trade left the average cockpit a little less experienced than the one it replaced. On the other side of the Pacific, in those same years, the American Air Arm was building something almost nobody back home thought much about: technicians by the hundreds of thousands. The Army Air Force's own post-war figures make the point. Every man who flew was backed by 4 ground technical specialists. The ratio of all ground personnel to flying personnel ran close to 7-to-1, and for every single man in actual air combat, 16 more served the force in some non-combat capacity. Between the summer of 1939 and the end of the war, training courses graduated more than 700,000 maintenance men, up from fewer than 900 a year in the years just before the war. A basic mechanics course that had taken 38 weeks to teach in 1938 was down to 16 weeks by 1943. And mobile training units, small traveling schools built around toolkits and cutaway engines, drove out to forward squadrons, so technicians rarely had to leave their post to learn a new aircraft type. What that ratio looked like on one flight line on a B-29 base in the Marianas was a crew chief and an assistant crew chief backed by 5 more airplane and engine mechanics assigned to that single aircraft, plus separate specialists down the line who handled nothing but armament, cameras, radios, and electrical systems. A B-29 stayed flying because of a standing team, each member responsible for one system, and none of them expected to also be expert in the others, not because of one exhausted man doing everything himself. More trained hands working harder than their counterparts was one part of the American system's real edge. The rest came from how the work itself was organized in tiers, so a broken part never had to travel further than necessary to reach someone able to fix it. Squadron crews handled the daily inspections, the swapped spark plug, the patched skin. Anything larger went back to a group or wing-level shop built for bigger jobs, an engine change, structural repair, serious battle damage. Anything beyond went further back still to a fixed depot or, after 1944, to a ship built for that exact purpose. A broken aircraft always had somewhere specific to go and someone specific waiting to receive it there. None of this made the American system effortless. In September 1944, the 65th Bombardment Squadron reported it was so short of qualified mechanics that it was putting truck drivers to work on aircraft and engine repair. a stopgap unit, records mention, without much comment, as though it were unremarkable. As late as the end of August 1945, the Far East Air Forces as a whole were still short some 2,159 men against their authorized ground strength. The gap between the two air arms was one of scale, of standardization, and of how fast each side could turn a civilian into a technician and get him to a flight line. By 1944, the shortfall that had opened at the start of the war had become the whole story. A growing shortage of spare parts began grounding Japanese aircraft for good over damage that would have been a routine field fix 2 years earlier. A fighter missing one part sat where it had rolled to a stop, sometimes for months, because no system existed for matching a broken aircraft in one revetment to a good part sitting in another, a few fields away. The American answer to a related problem, the sheer distance separating any fixed repair depot from the fighting, arrived that same year, under a program classified enough that it does not appear in the Army Air Force's own official history of its own air war. 6 Liberty ships and 18 smaller vessels went into a shipyard at Point Clear, Alabama in the spring of 1944, and came out the other side as floating machine shops, codenamed Ivory Soap because they floated. Soldiers assigned to crew them trained in the swimming pool of a nearby resort hotel before anyone let them near open water. Each of the 6 large ships carried close to 350 men and a startling spread of shops: machining and sheet metal, propeller and radiator repair, fabric and dope, an air-conditioned bench for delicate instruments and cameras, radio and radar, carburetor and turbo supercharger stations, everything short of a full engine rebuild. They carried their own defensive guns fore and aft back because a ship this valuable, anchored this close to the fighting, needed to be able to look after itself. The first of them, a converted freighter, renamed for an Army general, sailed for the Pacific that October and anchored off Saipan that November, carrying a pair of small Sikorsky helicopters apiece for ferrying parts and downed aircrew between islands, ready to receive whatever the Marianas Air Campaign sent back damaged. The rest of the fleet followed the fighting forward from there, on to Luzon, then Iwo Jima, then Okinawa, staying within reach of whichever airfield needed them most that month. Set that against the Japanese Army's main servicing base for the New Guinea front at Halmahera, 1,000 miles behind the fighting it was meant to support, always short of both equipment and mechanics. And the shape of the war's least visible weapon becomes hard to miss. A depot that cannot move to the front is not the same tool as a depot that sails to it, no matter how similar their equipment lists look on paper. By the last months of 1944, American air power over the Philippines turned Japan's parts problem into a full breakdown. Between October 1944 and February 1945, air raids against Clark, Nichols, and Nielsen fields put more than 1,500 Japanese aircraft out of action on the ground alone. Japanese ground crews answered the only way they could, by scattering. Repair shops, parts stores, and maintenance sections were broken up and hidden across the countryside around Clark, as far out as the town of Bamban, on the hope that dispersal would save them from the next raid. It did save some equipment. It also meant that a mechanic standing next to a grounded fighter, needing one specific broken part replaced, now had to guess which of a dozen scattered, half-buried caches might hold it. A problem the Americans had spent 3 years and hundreds of thousands of trained men building a system meant to avoid. Historians who have gone back through what records survive keep landing on much the same explanation for why Japan's planners never closed this gap in the first place. Fixing it would have meant treating ground crews as being just as valuable as pilots, and neither service, through the whole of the war, ever made that trade. On January 31st, 1945, the 37th Infantry Division's 145th Infantry Regiment crossed Clark Field's main runway, and the base, defended by some 30,000 Japanese troops of the improvised Kembu Group, pieced together from garrison units, service personnel, and whatever else was on hand, fell after 3 months of fighting. What the advancing Americans found on the ground was the dispersal strategy's logical endpoint. Investigators counted close to 500 Japanese aircraft in and around the airfield complex. Many burned wrecks, but a number of them sound and On paper, ready to fly. Near the town of Mabalacat, they counted more than 200 aircraft engines, several of them still sitting in their original shipping crates, hidden under houses, rice mills, and public buildings. Carburetors, fuel pumps, generators, and propellers lay scattered and buried across the surrounding fields in no pattern anyone could reconstruct, along with the tools needed to install them. One captured fighter, otherwise airworthy, was missing exactly one carburetor. It was somewhere in Mabalacat, buried with the rest. Nobody found it in time. Most of what is known about this particular gap comes from the Army Air Force's own post-war reports and the wreckage inventories Allied investigators filed at Clark Field itself, the kind of record that seldom makes it into the more familiar story of the Pacific Air War.